everyone. Hi, welcome. Hi, my name is Alexis Lowry. I'm an associate curator here at DIA, and I am thrilled to see you all here today on our Community Free Day. Thank you for joining us for the first of our DiaTalks series. It's a new series that expands on the Gallery Talk program and that invites scholars, curators, critics, and writers to consider the work of a single artist currently on view at DIA in the form of lectures, discussions, and symposia. I'm really happy that for the first DIA Talk, we are able to also talk about another first at DIA, which is the first time we've installed the work of Robert Morris, an installation that's open today to the public for the first time. That is it's unbelievable that this is the first time we've shown the work of Morris, who's such a pioneering figure of minimal and post-minimal art. And I just want to take a brief minute to say thank you to Bob for working with us so closely on realizing this incredible installation that I hope you have all already seen. And if you have not, please do so after this talk. I'm also very happy to introduce today's speaker, Jeffrey Weiss, who has worn many hats in the art world, and I will get to them, but among them is being a professor and who introduced me to minimal and post-minimal art, and who I am thrilled to be able to invite here because I owe him my own interest in this material. Jeffrey is a senior curator at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, and since 2010, he and Francesca Esme have been co-running the Panza Collection Initiative, a Mellon Foundation study project devoted to the museum's holding of minimal, post-minimal, and conceptual art. There, they've been unpacking the complicated formal, historical, and ethical questions surrounding the preservation and presentation of works of art from this period. And among others, they have been meticulously studying the work of Robert Morris. So I'm looking forward to hearing Jeffrey bring some of that material to bear on our current installation today. In addition to his work on the Panza Collection Initiative, he's also recently organized the, is that really loud? Hold on. Okay. He was the curator of Ankawara, Silence, an exhibition of the work of Ankawaras at the Guggenheim, which was a revelation, I think, to many people about Ankawara's incredibly deliberate practice. In addition to that, from 2000 to 2007, he was curator and head of the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art at the National Gallery, where he significantly expanded the collection in terms of works of art from the period that we're talking about here, 60s and 70s, and organized exhibitions on Rothko, Picasso, and Johns as well. And from 2007 to 2008, he was the director of DIA Art Foundation, so this is another homecoming of sorts, before he left to return to academia. Thank God you did, for me anyway, and many of your students, and where he also holds a PhD from. He was a professor at the Institute of Fine Arts, and his writings have been widely published in various periodicals on modern and contemporary post-war art, but his most recent book is a systematic catalog of the early objects of Robert Morris. So I think with that, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and here we go.
Thank you, Alexis. And thanks to all of you for coming. This is kind of amazing. Thank you very much. And my thanks go as well, of course, to Dia, to Jessica and James and Alexis for inviting me here, and also my compliments to them for the installation, the Morris installation. I'm going to especially talk about one of the two rooms today, the Greene Gallery, the plywood room. I think that the room looks fantastic, and it's a bit of a shock to see something that seems to have floated back from 1964 to the present, about which I'll have more to say in a minute. So I'm very happy to be back at DIA and to be speaking, and although this room is a little intimidating, but I'm going to do the best I can. My original intention was, in fact, to make these remarks extremely informal, as the occasion sounded like that of a gallery talk, which lends itself best to something like a narrated walkthrough. But the space of the Morris installation is too tight for that kind of thing, so now that we've moved to another room, I thought I would go ahead and prepare a talk, which I hope still remains informal enough, even as prepared remarks will allow me to take this topic through a few twists and turns, best served by forcing myself to adhere to a written account. In that regard, it's fitting that we're assembling in this great room of works by Gerhard Richter, since I have to say that as a setting, with respect to some of the issues I want to raise today, a hall of mirrors is relevant. The works we're here to consider are a group of 7 large form plywood constructions by Robert Morris that were conceived in the early 1960s and first produced for and shown at the Greene Gallery in New York in 1964 in what is universally taken to have been a landmark exhibition in the history of minimal art. This is certainly how it's addressed in the now standard reference on the topic of minimalism, written by Dia's curator James Meyer, who notes that the importance of the exhibition was already recognized at the time. These objects, as James says, are large in scale and environmentally contingent, a crucial factor that was largely new to the work of the period. What that means is that the works are conceived and installed to make strategic use of the entire envelope of the room, floor, walls, and ceiling, all planes that compose the room as a volume. And with the work called corner piece, even the corner of the room where walls meet each other and wall meets floor. James shrewdly notes that this approach to the space of the room was shared at that time only by the artist Dan Flavin, with his first exhibition of works solely composed of fluorescent lamps, a show that had in fact just preceded Morris's show at the Greene Gallery that year. So in 1964, the so-called Morris Plywood Show was an art historical marker for several reasons. The extreme formal reduction of the sculptural object, the deadpan nature of these objects as large, blank, gray-painted forms, their scale, through which the objects possess a one-to-one relation to the body of the beholder, and again, the way in which they are distributed within the room, sitting on the floor, supported by wall and floor together, wedged between 2 walls, hanging from the ceiling, and pushed into the corner being a space that had never before been colonized by sculptural objects of this size and with this kind of force, despite some precedent within the history of the Russian avant-garde, with objects of much smaller size. With respect to the 1964 Greene Gallery show, in fact, the matter of size and scale is a fundamental one in determining the way we encounter the objects in the space of the room. This is one of the things that Dia's reconstruction of the entire 1964 show tells us, in a way that showing objects of this kind, 1 or 2 at a time, or in groups that include works from different years, which is far more common, cannot do. That these objects are co-occupants with us of actual space is easy to take for granted now, from a vantage of over 50 years. But it was a breakthrough in 1964. To put it another way, these blank, bulky, volumetric constructions are, in a manner of speaking, in the way. They're not just available to us as experiments in, say, perceptual gestalt, our capacity to seize the full form of an object from one position, as opposed to the way we see it as we move around it, which is yet another function that has been assigned to this kind of work. And they're not just propositions concerning the history of sculptural form, in this case, perhaps partly derived from Morris's intense interest in Constantine Brancusi, about whom Morris wrote a master's thesis at Hunter College, completed 2 years later in 1966, but also from the work of Morris's contemporaries, including Donald Judd, as well as Tony Smith, Smith being an artist of the previous generation, but one whose work was of pointed relevance to the emergence of minimal art. In addition to being those things, the works at Greene can be said to have functioned in part as obstacles, obstructions or impediments to circulation through the gallery space, which is one of the reasons why I'm not conducting a gallery talk in the room in which they are installed today. Again, as James notes, Judd himself wrote an important review of the 1964 Greene Gallery show, and in his fashion as an art critic of spare, but incisive observation, he cut to the bone. In his review, Judd found himself approving of certain qualities. The objects were non-relational, he said. That is, they dispense with conventions of composition that are generally associated with most previous forms of both painting and sculpture, either figural or abstract. But unlike the work of contemporaries like Flavin and Frank Stella, Judd said, Morris's objects were so plain and undistinguished that they were close to being not art. Quote, many aspects often thought essential to art are missing, he wrote, such as imagery and composition, unquote. I'm still quoting Judd. Morris's work nearly appears not to be art. Perhaps he doesn't want it to be thought art at first, though, of course, it is, finally, unquote. Judd's review is a fascinating one. I think it's fair to say that he's struggling to absorb the significance of the work, of works he seemed to find it easy to admire, but perhaps for him hard to like. And I think that we can safely say that Judd's ambiguous reaction to the show was probably owing to the fact that the works seemed to be an open indictment of certain aesthetic values that were deeply important to Judd's own work. Values concerning attention to detail, even craft, and the way in which Judd, in his work, replaced imagery and composition with seriality and modular repetition, self-generating strategies of sculptural form. The subtext of Judd's review, then, is that Morris's work was, for Judd, an open challenge. Morris's pieces, he wrote, are minimal visually, but they're powerful physically. The occupancy of space, the access to or denial of it, is very specific. And while the works represent, quote, fairly ordinary geometric shapes and a very ordinary color, he said, they have been built. They've been made on purpose, not found, to be minimal, unimportant, relatively unordered objects, unquote. At the end of the review, Judd issued what might be seen as a counter-challenge to Morris. Quote, the works look well together, but it isn't an environment. There are 7 separate pieces. If Morris made an environment, it would certainly be one thing, unquote. It's unclear exactly what to do with this remark. At the time, no statement by Morris was made to the effect that the 7 objects of Greene were a single work, or even an integrated installation overall. And over the years, they've been remade and reshown and acquired as individual works. Yet the fact that Judd saw fit to say what he did seems to mean that, given the way the works were made to inhabit all regions of the real space of the room, the show came on as if it were of a piece. The 1964 show was, then, a remarkable one, and looking back, the objects in it are historically essential. It's because the works are so important that I think we're invited, in fact, required, to keep turning them around in our collective historical imagination. One way I have found to keep them in play is to address them in a way that may seem counterintuitive, but that makes them hopefully, usefully less familiar than they have become, according to the historiography of critical reception. This means addressing the objects as objects, from a material vantage, including that of their fabrication. So here I should explain that what I know about the basic conditions under which the object was produced in 1964, to the extent that those conditions can, with the artist's help, be recalled, comes from work that I've been doing at the Guggenheim, as Alexis said. There, Morris's work of the 60s and 70s has been the object of a lengthy study over the past 5 or 6 years in a project co-funded by the Mellon Foundation, called the Panza Collection Initiative. I co-run and collaborate on the project with the conservator Francesca Esme. Our work has been devoted to the museum's vast holdings of minimal, post-minimal, and conceptual art, which were acquired by the museum from the collector Giuseppe Panza in 1992. Above all, the Panza study project concerns itself with questions of the preservation versus the refabrication of artworks from this period by a number of artists, including Flavin, Morris, and Judd, as well as Bruce Nauman, Carl Andre, Richard Serra, and Robert Irwin, among numerous others. In the course of our work, we've conducted many interviews, and it's from lengthy interviews with Bob, along with other exchanges I have been having with him for some time now, that the information I'm sharing with you today comes, although some of the conclusions I draw are mine, not his. But I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge how generous he has been to us in our work at the museum. About the object of 1964, Morris had been conceiving and fabricating large plywood works of this kind since 1961. Up to and just beyond the Greene Gallery show, these works were made by the artist himself, who had, as he has explained, good basic carpentry skills that he acquired from various occupations, such as framing houses, at which he worked when he was a younger man in the Midwest. The amount of skill required to produce these objects at the time can be described, and it has been by Morris, as essentially good enough. Good enough in the practical sense to make an object that will stand up and do its job. There was no question of refined technical expertise or craft at stake in this body of work, not just practically speaking, but aesthetically and ethically so. The objects were conceived as basic forms, and they were fabricated according to basic standards of making. They were not intended to be scrutinized as aesthetic objects in the conventional sense. They were intended instead, as I have been saying so far, to function within the space of the room in certain fundamental physical and perceptual ways. And that's it. It's also important to know that a good deal of the works fabricated at the time were made on the occasion of shows and or occasional sales. Some were also made by Morris in a more experimental sense, to test them within the space of the studio, and you can see them in early photographs. But most of the objects that were imagined and sketched in notebook drawings went unbuilt until needed, and indeed some have still never been made. This was the case with the 7 objects in the '64 Greene Gallery show. As Morris has explained it to us, the slot for the show at Greene from December 1964 to January '65 came up somewhat unexpectedly, perhaps due to the cancellation of another project, and Dick Bellamy, the director of the Greene Gallery, asked Morris if he would like to step in. Morris agreed and chose works for the show and then built them. The plywood was cut and the objects fabricated in his studio on Church Street, then dismantled, transported to the gallery as component parts, and reassembled on site, where they were also painted or repainted light gray. No sales were made directly from the Greene Gallery show. After the exhibition was over, the plywood objects were dismantled again and transported back to the studio in pieces. Once Morris relocated from Church Street to a new studio on Greene Street, moving this massive amount of plywood from Church to Greene was simply too inconvenient and perhaps deemed unnecessary. The works, now in the form of a collection of parts, were left behind, with the plywood having been either reused or simply discarded by the next occupant. So the objects that actually appeared in the Greene Gallery plywood show in 1964 ceased to exist a long time ago. Now, of course, it's crucial to add that the scenario I'm describing is completely in keeping with the nature of the work as we have come to understand it historically. The narrative I just recited to you, as simple as it is, doesn't appear in the literature on this artist, partly because for decades it had no real place in various approaches to interpreting the work. That is, again, the largely propositional nature of Morris's work at the time means that the works in the Greene Gallery show were not produced to be unique aesthetic objects per se. Instead, they were made to serve their purpose in the space of the room. Morris has since been at great pains to explain, above all, to misguided collectors and museum curators, that there is no such thing in this context as an original, that every one of these early objects were, in a sense, reproductions of a form, a kind of Platonic form, he has even said, and that this means that one iteration of a work cannot be privileged over another based on the date it was made. The works were freely remade during the period, and of course, in the case of the room here at Dia, as well as a variety of objects that now belong to the holdings of the Guggenheim, they continue to be refabricated over the years, down to the present day. Nonetheless, the topic of fabrication, it seems to me, begs me to address the work and the new room here at Dia from the vantage of curatorial practice, or better, to speak about it while standing at the intersection where curatorial practice, in the context of the imperatives of the institutions of art as a place to show and or preserve work, intersects with the practice of the historian, who is concerned with tracing the multiple historical narratives that attend any important work of art. To do this, I need to briefly recall the broader context concerning the works under consideration today. The era of roughly 1960 to 1975 is one marked in general by the decline of the unique aesthetic object, the decline of objects produced directly by the hand of the artist as author, objects that represent choices and inflections of making that contribute to their status as unique. Rather, in art making after 1960, there often is no privileged original object as such, only iterations, one or many, of a work in object form. The work as conceived may be the subject of a rough sketch or instructions or even an elaborate working drawing, and with these instructions, an object can be made over and over according to a specific criteria, dimensions, materials, methods of construction, and retain primary formal qualities from one example to the next, yet refer to the priority of no original. A second factor concerns the materials that are at stake in art making after 1960 and that are largely and strategically derived from industry and commercial manufacture. Non-fine art materials of this kind lend themselves in theory and practice to close association with the imperatives of non-fine art forms of making by individuals or shops, which are often largely functional and which, in the world of manufacture, are intended to serve replication and thereby to demote the role and prejudice of craft. Still, other factors intensify these basic conditions. An artist might change mediums in the process of refining the way a given object represents the work. I'm distinguishing object from work here in order to hold a distinction between the conception of the work and its realization as object, which realization can take multiple forms over time. Or the artist could maintain a single medium, as Dan Flavin did with the fluorescent lamp, yet have the work refabricated in response to improvements of function or of design in the manufacturing industry for that medium. And in the case of the collector Giuseppe Panza, whose collection amassed in the 60s and 70s was acquired by the Guggenheim, there's yet another somewhat anomalous factor as well. Based in part on a misunderstanding of the terms of the work, objects could also be subject to unauthorized fabrication on the part of the owner. And they could be shown in that form in exhibitions, which, much to the hostility of Dan Flavin, Donald Judd, and Carl Andre, whose work was in fact subjected by Panza to unauthorized or unsupervised fabrication, they were. All of these circumstances are further complicated again after around 1960 by the significance of paperwork, of plans, proposals, working drawings, dealer contracts, documents, and certifications of ownership and authenticity, which together underwrite a world of copies without originals, and that therefore also produced a high degree of misunderstanding and miscommunication in that regard. Finally, the artist himself could also return to a work conceived in, say, the mid-60s from a later vantage of 10 or 20 or 30 years, as Morris has frequently done, subjecting the work to refabrication such that, due to variance, the material identity of the early object may appear to have become moot. Again, according to Morris, there is no original, so we're speaking, in his case, of multiple versions or examples of a work in a single medium, such as plywood, as well as copies over time in a variety of materials, above all plywood, fiberglass, aluminum, and steel. All of this is to say that, given the proliferation of variants, many of which don't reflect the intervention of an authorial hand, the historical and conceptual, as well as material circumstances of the aesthetic object after 1960 were in transition and therefore unstable. In this regard, authenticity as a value is itself unfixed. So, for example, as curators who stand between the history of art and art's present institutional needs, we might find ourselves asking this question. If the 7 objects of the Greene Gallery show had been kept rather than destroyed, and had come down to us in a perfectly good state of repair, yet showed their age, which is inevitably reflected on the surfaces of most objects, would there be a qualitative difference between them that would favor the first set of objects over the one that was fabricated last month? Does the historical status of the object as artifact have any bearing whatsoever on its aesthetic significance? Is there such a thing as authenticity in this case? Perhaps we're faced with opposing two ideas about that. Faced, that is, with, on the one hand, weighing the authenticity of an early object if we believe that the historical identity of that object is meaningful, because maybe it contains important historical information about the conditions under which the work was produced when it first saw the light of day, of weighing that against, on the other hand, the authenticity of the terms of the work, which terms openly permit the perpetuation of the work in the form of iterations or copies and the like. I can tell you that for Morris, privileging the terms of the work rather than the early object is the only truly valid choice. And valuing an early object, at least aesthetically speaking, is hopelessly obtuse. I'm inclined to agree with him, but since I'm the curator, or so to speak, the keeper, and not the artist, if I'm to maintain a critical and self-critical relation to the choices I make, I can't keep from giving historical and perhaps philosophical consideration to what I see as a neglected, surprisingly complex set of questions in all of this. My hope is that, in fact, doing so not only keeps me alert to the significance of the choices I make, but that it gives me something I can channel back into my understanding of the deep historical significance of this body of work. Put differently, whatever authenticity is in this context, it's a moving target. If the artist's practice allows for change or makes change one of its authentic terms, authenticity of this kind has a way of throwing curveballs at any attempt institutions of art make to recapture the frozen moment of art historical time. These are decidedly not questions we generally ask of work of the 1960s, although they are emerging now more broadly throughout the field as early exhibitions are recreated at museums and as museum collections face surprisingly complicated questions about the correct way to address problems of preservation, fabrication, and display. In this regard, the conversations at the Guggenheim with Bob Morris have been front-loaded by questions of condition, preservation, refabrication, pro and con, and the way in which those things reflect on the nature of the work. And as inappropriate as those topics once seemed, raising them has some value and some bearing, I would say, on our interpretation of the work. To continue my historical account of fabrication and to make a very long story very short for our purposes today, throughout the period, Morris has experimented with a number of materials for the fabrication of works of this kind, which he made and showed into the late 60s. This included, as I was saying before, plywood as well as fiberglass, and at least at first on paper, in letters to potential collectors, for example, and in his notebooks, aluminum and steel. Eventually, he made the objects with the help of others and finally delegated their fabrication to others altogether, as methods of construction in some of these materials came to require a certain amount of technical expertise that he did not necessarily have. And again, to make it continually clear, the artist's hand, according to Morris, has no role to play in the intended significance of the object. So where does this narrative leave us with respect to the 7 objects of the 1964 Greene Gallery show? The Panza holdings at the Guggenheim actually include 8 works dating from the 1960s that belong to this category of work that was initiated by, this category of work that was initiated by the exhibition at the Greene Gallery, including one work called Cornerpiece that Panza also acquired decades ago. It's no secret that in our case, we have virtually every possible incarnation of objects of this kind. Some were acquired by Panza directly out of exhibitions rather than having been remade. They are early objects, although they show signs of wear and tear that make them mostly unsuitable for display. Some of the works were remade for Panza with Morris's supervision, although those refabrications occur in various mediums during different periods of time, which means that their material qualities change from one to the next, at times significantly. Others were remade by Panza's fabricators in Italy with Morris's consent, but without his supervision, with bad results for the soundness of the object. In this case, we appear to own the work as such, but until we refabricate it, we have no viable version to show. Still others have now been refabricated by the museum in the context of our Panza collection project with the artist's close supervision, as was done for Dia. In that effort, after much deliberation, Morris asked that we do so in plywood, even in the case of objects that were originally made in fiberglass, a medium that, looking back on it from a distance of decades, he now believes was a misguided choice, even if at the time its qualities, as opposed to those of painted plywood, struck him as having been right for the nature of the work as a blank, sharp-edged form. All of this has motivated me to consider the work of this artist from a material vantage, something that had previously seemed unimportant. In the course of our work at the museum, I found myself asking, what have we all been looking at over the years? Most historians of the period, myself included, haven't had much acquaintance with any physical manifestation of works like this over time, or our encounter with it was one that we might have had years in the past. So when the topic comes up in books and essays, it came to seem clear to me that most of us were using the two extant photographs of the Greene Gallery show as touchstones, and more or less disregarding the objects as such, sometimes out of neglect, sometimes because we thought we shouldn't have to care. In this context, for me, the complex material history of the materials and refabrications in Morris's historical practice, as well as in this history of the different ways the work has looked over time when it has been shown in galleries and museums and private collections, a history that begins in 1964 but obviously does not end there, came to suggest that far from having become immaterial, so to speak, the work's material means had thickened as a consideration. Is it worth thinking about these objects in that way? Or is doing so a violation of the work's intrinsic historical and conceptual terms? Recalling the circumstances of Morris's work in general during the early 60s can help answer that question. It's helpful, for instance, to know that Morris's activity at the time had many parts. He was working closely with dancers, such as Simone Forti and Yvonne Rainer, who were pursuing forms of dance that sought to push performance practice in new directions, depriving it of the aesthetic conventions of classical and modern dance, and substituting instead actions that were often task-related, for example, non-gestural, non-metaphorical, without referential meaning of any kind. These performances often included objects, some of them built by Morris, that resemble the forms we see here today in the other room. And their relation to the body, something we address in relation to shows like the one at Greene in 1964, was a significant factor. During this period as well, Morris also produced a number of much smaller sculptures, objects partly derived from his interest in Marcel Duchamp and Jasper Johns. A typology of these works includes small boxes and other containers, plaques or wall reliefs in lead that are mounted with rulers and other measuring devices, works containing batteries and cables, sculptures with blank keys that have been stamped with words, sculptures that were designed to record the effects of chance operations on a given medium, such as soft plaster, and anomalous works, such as one in which a meter measures the amount of energy consumed by a light bulb. These works were referred to at the time by Morris as process-type objects, and they were in part fabricated by the artist himself, almost as if to represent research in conceptual and mechanical and chemical processes that, given the concerns of Morris's other works, can be thought of as analogs to the processes of the human body. One such work, perhaps especially relevant to the works under consideration today, is called Box with the Sound of Its Own Making, and it's just that, a cube, roughly 9 inches on each side, made of walnut, that contains concealed inside a tape recording of the sounds made by the artist over the course of the 3 hours it took to fabricate it. Much has been written about this ingeniously recursive object, which was, as the artist has said, beloved by John Cage, who, on a visit to Morris's studio, God bless him, was apparently moved to recline on the floor in its presence and listen to the entire tape. I'm citing all of this, the work with avant-garde performance, the process objects, the box with sound, all of which, after all, belongs to a single practice, in order to frame the 7 objects of the '64 Greene Gallery show in a context from which they are sometimes removed. And above all, in order to help me give consideration to the relevance of medium and the long history of fabrication in changing materials, fabrication in changing materials to the significance of the work. That is, the works are primarily blank forms and are intended to function that way, but they are also made things, and their own history includes a lot of labor on the part of the artist, along with others. And they belong to an historical narrative according to which Morris wrestled many times with which materials would best serve the work's aesthetic function. Somewhat ironically, in the case of works like those in the Greene Gallery show, that aesthetic function was itself based on the idea that whatever medium was used to make these works, if that material was doing its job with respect to the perceptual and physical presence of these objects in the space of the room, then by conceit, it would become almost invisible, the medium would, or transparent. In other words, we're certainly not supposed to enter the 1964 Greene Gallery exhibition and say, wow, great use of plywood, of course. Yet materials aren't invisible, and the fact that Morris did move from plywood to fiberglass to steel and aluminum over time, and then more recently back to plywood, when choosing to make and remake objects like this that are otherwise said to represent a work that dates to, say, 1964, implicates 2 things. First, for an artist, a work is rarely fixed in place, and practical solutions to problems raised by one form of work versus another can change based on experience as well as second thoughts. Secondly, and this is more speculative, repeated fabrication and/or replication also suggests that changing materials may be thought to represent a changing interpretation over the years on the part of the artist about what the works are historically as opposed to how they live now. Moreover, changing materials and methods of making would, again, rightly or wrongly, certainly influence what artists have taken away from Morris's work of this kind when they saw it during the 60s, then the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and beyond. And finally, perhaps iteration of this kind needs to be built back into what we say regarding the historical significance of the work. There may be no original, but the problematic of original and copy is nonetheless at stake. So in closing, I want to return to the Greene Gallery objects in the context of the reception of Morris's work in the 1960s, now by way of material concerns. I can do this by invoking one critic, David Anton, who wrote important texts about Morris at the time and who gives us a glimpse into how material terms might, in fact, influence what one thinks and says. Anton wrote about the 1964 Greene Gallery show in 1966, along with works by Morris that were shown together at the Greene Gallery in Los Angeles that year. At the Greene Gallery, the works were made from plywood, as they are today. At the Greene show, a series of new but related objects were produced in fiberglass. In both cases, the objects were painted gray. Anton observes that the objects are simple and passive, and he means radically so, such that one problem they raise is that of identifying exactly what they are. He asks 3 questions that are intended to structure his examination of the work. What is it? Is it enough? And why isn't it? Questions that motivate or frame an exercise on his part in close looking at objects that were perhaps not meant to be truly closely scrutinized at all. In his text, Anton sets up a critical aporia in which he first claims that the works defy analysis and then proceeds to analyze them. It's a remarkable piece of writing, whether or not you agree with its method, and to sum up for my purposes today, the text depends on making perceptual and material distinctions from one show to the next that, once you've read Anton, can be hard to ignore. By this, I mean that Anton anticipates what I would refer to in light of what I have been saying today as the work's contingency. For example, he refers to an element of surprise in the work. Surprise in scale, surprise in shape, surprise in mass, surprise in position, all qualities that seem to contradict the fact that these objects were being described at the time as literal, deliberately self-evident, and deadpan. Turning to surface qualities, he continues that between Greene and Dwan, between plywood and fiberglass, quote, only the grayness of the paint seems constant, though even this is to some extent open to question. Still quoting, in the fiberglass pieces, because the paint is very matte and there are no joints in the plastic, there is no visible point at which the paint leaves off and the material begins, so that the pieces appear to be sudden materializations of some indefinable gray substance that congealed under unknown conditions into these massive volumes. Still quoting Anton, with the plywood, it's different. The lines of juncture are evident and the paint lies on top. The largest pieces look relatively weightless, like continuous enclosed surfaces rather than volumes. In the Greene show, still quoting, in the Greene show in '64, the paint was so light it appeared white rather than gray, though the artist, his gallery, and the paint can say gray. At what point does gray become white? The question is, what are we looking at? Close quote. Anton then addresses what he calls, with an enviable turn of phrase, the white show at Greene as a collection of autonomous objects as opposed to an installation of integrated parts. That is, he acknowledges that the show possessed an overall identity, that of a silent no-scape, and he says that the show at Dwan, with its low gray hills and wedges, qualifies in this sense also. But, he continues, the works in both shows, quote, can and have been moved from place to place and undoubtedly will be moved again in the future, unquote. And he remarks on what he calls Morris's use of light. Certain objects qualify, he says, as, quote, the creation of new surfaces in a manifold of air and light. It's an art of sudden materializations and dematerializations. Now you see it, now you don't. And a little bit of the silent movie where objects confront you, always in a way for which you are never quite prepared, unquote. I think what Anton's text, coming as it does just 1 year after Judd's, and already taking critical response to Morris's work to a new place, reminds us is that these objects live in the world and have always lived over time in a variety of physical and material ways. Whether or not they are relevant to the recent historiography, the material values associated with medium and fabrication are undeniably in play, especially when the objects are encountered by artists and by curators and conservators, especially when it comes time to preserve them or remake them in the context of showing them to a larger audience. And I would argue that the multiple versions of the work now that have been made and shown over the course of decades, be they reproductions, replicas, iterations, copies, examples, or whatever term you choose, complicate the life of the work as an idea, as something that is activated in multiple ways in installations as well as in photographs, never mind the studio, and activated as well in the memory of those who, perhaps over a span of decades, encountered more than one of their many sudden materializations and dematerializations over time. The pieces influence space, Anton also wrote in 1966 of Morris's large form objects, and that's something you can now test thanks to the artist's collaboration with Dia by entering the next room. Quote, in the most profoundly sculptural sense, he said, these simple forms really determine the space into which they are put, unquote. I would only add that they influence or activate multiple temporalities as well. Morris once told me that regarding the smaller sculptures he was making in the 1960s, the so-called process-type objects, he wanted the works to reflect or record or represent the fact that making them took time, something somewhat lost in the larger works. I wanted, he said, to stuff time back into the objects I was making. I suppose I would say that this invites us to raise the question of the life of the object in historical time as well, and that includes the objects that were made for the White show at Greene. Objects subject to refabrication can, in one sense, be said to escape time. But what are variants and versions of objects, if not, finally, dispersed component parts that together contribute to the idea of the work, not as fixed, but as a complex, formal, conceptual, and historical whole that unfolds in time. The idea of the work as a temporal proposition that may have begun life in 1964, but since that time has never really stopped. Thank you. Thank you. I'm told to take questions, so I will, if there are any. Barbara?
You can't answer. Only Bob Morris can answer this question.
Start over again.
Can you hear me?
Please.
Yeah. Okay. Jeffrey Weiss has established that the room that you see here is a reproduction. And now, Schwitter's Merzbau had been reproduced many times, and it was known that it was being reproduced. This is a question that only Bob Morris can answer. You can't answer it. So this is a question to the artist who I noticed was here. One of the questions is, did he know of the Merzbau reconstructions or copies? And the other question is, does this installation correspond in his mind to the original Greene Gallery installation, which I saw? And this does not feel like it. So I'm asking Bob Morris that question.
No.
Next question.
Well, okay, can I ask this question?
Okay, follow-up question.
That maybe James Meyer and Jeffrey Weiss, who are more voluble, perhaps can answer. In remaking that Greene Gallery installation, I know there were questions, and one of the reasons it doesn't feel the same is that the dimensions of the container, that is the architectural structure, are very different. And I don't know even, and this is again a question to Mr. Morris, is that paint the same? Is it the same color? Does he remember? And are the objects the same size?
Well, it's really interesting that you're raising all of this. I want to make sure and explain that that the larger argument that I'm making is that these are things we should and can ask, but they may or may not have any bearing on on what others think are the terms of authenticity that attend this kind of work.
I'm not talking about authenticity. I'm talking about experience.
And historicity as well. I mean, you're talking about the early...
I'm not talking about historicity. I'm talking about the experience. I did see the Greene Gallery show, and Morris obviously not only made it, but saw it. Maybe other people saw it as well here. But it had a very different feeling. It was a different experience. That's what I'm trying to say.
I've made these pieces. When I remake them, I often change the dimensions slightly. And that gray was called Pilgrim Gray. It's no longer made. I've also painted them slightly different colors of gray. So things keep changing over time, and they don't remain the same.
Well, then do you consider this installation a different work from the Greene Gallery installation?
Yes and no.
That's a cop-out.
Oh, that's a good answer. I'll just add in a pedantic footnote that this gray paint is something that we at the Guggenheim also tried to locate historically, as if this really matters, and maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, yes and no, and failed. Judd calls it Merkin Pilgrim Gray in his review, and that Merkin was a paint manufacturer, and Pilgrim Gray was probably probably one of the inventory of gray paints that was commercially available. We haven't been able to find it, but if anybody at Dia has located a can on eBay, then we'd love to know.
Can I be heard? Yes. So thank you for your question, Barbara. Where are you? Wonderful. Well, Barbara Rose, of course, wrote one of the great essays on minimal art, ABC art, at the time. So Barbara, it's a great question. I think what I would want to say is that this is a different time and a different place. It's 2016, not 1964. It's Dia Beacon, not Dick Bellamy's gallery on 57th Street. And so how do you adjust that work, that ensemble, for a different time and for a different place? And we certainly struggled with this question that you're raising. And we thought about the scale of that space. We thought about making this installation acknowledge its presentness, its historicity, and the place that we're in, and not doing a period piece. You can't reconstruct Dick Bellamy's space. It was smaller, you're absolutely right. It had wood floors, it had a different scale. And so this has been part of the problematic, and it seemed perhaps to us more honest to acknowledge the current placeness, the current time in which we're doing this, to make that work alive for current viewers today. It is a different experience. Another, to sort of go back, would be an act of nostalgia and perhaps a misrepresentation of the earlier piece. So these are lots of questions that were posed, and fortunately we had the artist himself to guide us in the making of this installation. And of course, as he just said, he chose a slightly darker gray. The Merkin Pilgrim gray no longer exists, and this was chosen by Bob for this space, for these objects, and for now. So I think that's perhaps what I might say to your question.
I just have a comment to make about that. I think 1964 is 52 years ago, so you've changed, and probably your recollection of what it was has changed also, which touches upon what your whole speech was about.
Yeah, I mean, I would just interject and say and agree, and say that one factor of consideration is, which is often bracketed out of the critical literature, and certainly the way in which we talk about the work, is memory, what the work has meant historically, and partly by being reshown, and also partly by disappearing, and that during that absence, it's conjured in other ways. And this is, of course, something that we can say about many, many kinds of works of art, but it's less often said about works from the 60s because the terms change. So I guess I'm trying to make an effort to bring some of those questions that are unfamiliar, that are familiar to us with respect to other things, into an historical setting in which they might be usefully disorienting or defamiliarizing. Well, this is the kind of debate that I hope we can continue to have. I mean, it's something that we find ourselves talking about a lot in the field these days, and also back at the museum where we're facing many of these considerations. And so I suppose I would say that in the spirit of continuing, we can bring this to a close. But James, I think you have more to add.
I had a question for you, actually. I very much enjoyed the way you're teasing out for us the materiality of those objects. And one of the reasons perhaps it was a bit repressed for some of us, or we didn't really talk about it, is because in Bob's criticism of the period, Notes on Sculpture 1 and 2, as you know, Bob is talking about shape and about perception and about the beholder. And the materiality of those minimal type works, he doesn't really talk about. And it's not until his Notes on Sculpture 3 and Antiform in the late 60s criticism that the materiality of the sculpture is coming to the forefront, and the activity of making is being theorized. And so perhaps some of us we all overlooked the materiality of the minimal works, perhaps because his earlier criticism overlooks it or says it was repressed.
Yeah.
Remember, he says minimal type work, sort of, it's about the reasonableness of the built. It doesn't enough acknowledge its materiality. So his criticism, which is so powerful about this art, guided many of us to thinking about the sculpture. And it's great that you're actually bringing out the materiality of the earlier work, which we all overlooked.
Well, thank you. I think that that's a point I passed through very quickly, but that I absolutely agree with your diagnosis of the situation. And it's often the case that critics move in packs. You know, we influence each other. The conversation is a single one at a particular time, and then it changes when new people come. And it's in that context we often follow what it is the artist himself says about the work. And Bob Morris's writings of the period are, as James said, enormously important. They're really foundational in many respects to theorizing about the work during the 60s and 70s, and it was a very hard influence to escape. So there's an anxiety there, I think, in the Bloomian sense that we need to overcome in order to take this to another place, if it's appropriate. And the question is whether or not it is. Well, we can't know that for sure until we just have it out. The other thing that I would say is that one of the things that brought me back to this was the things that Bob was doing as opposed to the things he was saying during that period. So these other objects, the dance participation and the other objects he was making, which I worked on in the book that Alexis mentioned, seemed to be telling me something. They looked like they belonged to two different practices, but as many people have told me who were there, no, it's all one thing. And to the extent that it may be, I guess I found myself using the other objects as a tool or an instrument to bring back to the bigger constructed forms, to see what one thing could tell me about the other that might have been otherwise eliminated from the discourse at that particular moment in time. Is there any other?
Oh, thank you for your remarks, and I just wanted to say that for me, the trajectory continues through fiberglass and steel to those objects that he made for Castelli about a year and a half or two ago that were made in exquisite hardwood, fine craftsmanship, and the sense of humor that I see in that exhibit, where he is playing with this idea by putting gigantic price tags on beautifully made works, and sort of laughing again at his own joke that has to do with reiterations and questions of originality, and how a form itself gives life to a story that continues on forever.
Yeah, well said, well said.
Okay, I think.
Well, thanks to all of you
Thank you,
again for being
Jeffrey.
such a great audience.
Okay, I think Bob will say one quick thing for us too as well.
I just want to thank all the people who made this possible here. And first of all, Jeffrey, for your insightful remarks and the subjects that seem to continue to be discussed. Thank you for that. And I also want to thank Jessica Morgan, director of DIA, and Barbara Castelli, and James Meyer, and Natalie D. Gunsberg of the board. All of you people were essential to making this happen. And for the work here, for Alexis Lowry and Heidi Giannotti and her crew, and Josh Finn, who fabricated these plywood pieces, and my assistant Ryan Roa, who installed dirt and felt. Thank you all very much.